I was standing in the corner of Marcus's parents' pristine living room, nursing a glass of lukewarm white wine, when his hand connected with my cheek so hard the sound echoed through their marble-floored mansion. The crystal chandelier above seemed to sway from the force of it, and in that moment of stunned silence, I saw his mother's perfectly manicured hand fly to her mouth in shock, while his father simply nodded approvingly. What they didn't know was that in 48 hours, they would discover exactly who their precious son had just struck in front of their country club friends and political donors. They had no idea that the woman they'd been treating like damaged goods for the past 6 months was about to turn their carefully constructed world upside down. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 42, I'm what most people would politely call a work in progress. At least that's how Marcus always introduced me to his social circle. "This is Sarah, she's figuring things out," he'd say with that patronizing smile that made my skin crawl. To his family, the prestigious Blackwood clan of Charleston's old money elite, I was the slightly broken woman their son had picked up somewhere along the way. A charity case with calloused hands, discount store clothes, and what his mother, Eleanor, delicately referred to as an unfortunate past. The truth was, I did look the part they'd cast me in. My auburn hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, streaked with premature gray that I'd never bothered to color. I wore the same rotation of faded jeans, comfortable sweaters, and worn combat boots that had seen better days. My hands bore the permanent stains and small scars of someone who worked with them, and I carried myself with the kind of quiet wariness that comes from places most people in their circle had never been. To them, I was everything their son shouldn't have brought home. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment above Chen's Auto Repair, the small garage I'd been running for the past 3 years in a working-class neighborhood 20 minutes from downtown Charleston. The shop was nothing fancy, just a converted warehouse with hydraulic lifts, tool chests that had seen decades of use, and a small office where I handled the books between oil changes and brake repairs. Most of my customers were locals who appreciated honest work at fair prices, people who understood what it meant to stretch a dollar and make things last. The apartment upstairs was exactly what you'd expect from someone barely keeping their head above water. Secondhand furniture, a kitchen table that wobbled, and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. I had a coffee maker that only worked when you hit it just right, a television from 2015, and a mattress I'd bought from a classified ad. The walls were mostly bare, except for a few photographs I kept deliberately vague, landscape shots and generic city scenes that revealed nothing about who I really was or where I'd really been. When Marcus first wandered into my shop 6 months ago, with a BMW that wouldn't start, I could see the wheels turning in his head. Here was this woman, clearly down on her luck, running a grimy auto repair shop in the kind of neighborhood his friends drove through with their doors locked. He saw someone he could save, someone who would be grateful for his attention and the access he could provide to a better life. Someone who would never question his authority or challenge his place in the social hierarchy he'd inherited. Marcus Blackwood was 38, meticulously groomed, and had never worked a day in his life that didn't involve a corner office and an expense account. He'd inherited his position as vice president of Blackwood Holdings from his father, along with a trust fund that ensured he'd never have to worry about money. His idea of hardship was having to wait more than 5 minutes for a table at his favorite restaurant. He drove cars that cost more than most people made in a year and lived in a downtown penthouse that his parents had purchased as a graduation gift. What drew him to me, I realized later, wasn't attraction or genuine interest. It was the project I represented. I was someone he could fix, elevate, and ultimately control. Someone who would owe him for lifting them out of their circumstances. In his mind, I should have been grateful that someone from his social stratum had even noticed me, let alone chosen to date me. His family's reaction to me was exactly what you'd expect from Charleston aristocracy. His mother, Eleanor, a woman who'd never met a charity gala she didn't chair or a social cause she couldn't turn into a networking opportunity, treated me with the kind of polite condescension reserved for the help. She spoke to me slowly and loudly, as if my modest circumstances had somehow affected my hearing or intelligence. She offered me advice on everything from my appearance to my career choices, always framed as helpful suggestions from someone who clearly knew better. His father, William Blackwood, was even worse. He barely acknowledged my existence except to make pointed comments about people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and the importance of knowing one's place in society. He had the kind of casual cruelty that comes from generations of privilege, the ability to dismiss entire categories of people without ever questioning his right to do so. To him, I was a temporary distraction his son would eventually outgrow once he came to his senses. Their friends were no better. At the Guy, dinner parties and charity events Marcus insisted on dragging me to, I was treated like an exotic pet he'd brought for entertainment. They'd ask me about the real world with the kind of fascination usually reserved for documentaries about foreign countries. They wanted to hear stories about financial struggle and physical labor, but only the sanitized versions that would confirm their assumptions about the nobility of honest work, without challenging their comfort with their own inherited advantages. The worst part wasn't their condescension, though that was painful enough. It was watching Marcus absorb their attitudes and begin to reflect them back at me. The man who'd initially seemed charmed by my independence and self-reliance gradually became someone who criticized everything about my life. My apartment was embarrassing. My clothes were inappropriate. My work was beneath someone who was dating a Blackwood. I needed to do something about my appearance, my social skills, my entire way of being in the world. He started making decisions for me without asking. He'd show up at my shop and announce that we were going somewhere that required me to change clothes, then criticize my choices when I came back downstairs. He'd order for me at restaurants, explaining to servers that I wasn't familiar with certain types of cuisine. He'd answer questions directed at me during conversations, as if I couldn't be trusted to represent myself adequately. The progression was so gradual that I almost didn't notice it happening. One day, I was an independent business owner running my own life, and the next I was being treated like a reclamation project that wasn't progressing fast enough. Marcus began to exhibit the kind of casual possessiveness that his father had probably shown his mother, the assumption that his preferences and opinions should naturally take precedence over mine. But I stayed. I told myself it was because I enjoyed certain aspects of the relationship, the financial security that came with dating someone wealthy, the access to experiences I couldn't afford on my own. Really, though, I was curious. I wanted to see how far he'd push things, how much he thought he could get away with. I wanted to understand exactly who these people were when they thought no one was watching who mattered. The shop provided the perfect cover for this social experiment. Everyone assumed that a woman running a small auto repair business was exactly what she appeared to be. Someone without options or alternatives, someone grateful for whatever opportunities came her way. They never looked past the surface, never asked the right questions, never wondered why someone with my particular set of skills had ended up in their orbit. I'd perfected the art of being underestimated over the years. I knew how to dress down, how to deflect questions about my background, how to present myself as someone who was exactly what she appeared to be, and nothing more. I'd learned that people see what they expect to see, and they rarely expect much from a middle-aged woman in work clothes running a small business in a forgotten part of town. Marcus and his family saw exactly what they wanted to see. A woman who needed saving, who should be grateful for their attention, who would eventually be molded into something more appropriate for their social circle. They never imagined that I might have my own reasons for being exactly where I was, doing exactly what I was doing. They certainly never considered that I might be studying them as closely as they thought they were examining me. The evening of the slap started like so many others. Marcus had informed me that morning that we were expected at his parents' house For dinner with some family friends, political donors who were considering backing his father's latest business venture. He'd laid out clothes for me to wear, expensive pieces he'd bought without consulting me, items that transformed me into someone who looked like she belonged in their world, but felt completely foreign to herself. I'd arrived at the Blackwood mansion, on Trad Street exactly on time, as always. The house was a testament to old Charleston money, with its grand piazza, antique furnishings, and walls lined with portraits of ancestors who'd built their fortune on the backs of others. Eleanor greeted me with her usual air kisses and immediate suggestions for improvement, while William barely looked up from his bourbon and newspaper. The dinner guests were exactly what you'd expect: politicians, business leaders, and their perfectly coiffed wives, all engaged in the kind of conversation that revealed nothing while establishing everyone's position in the social hierarchy. I played my part perfectly, speaking when spoken to, asking appropriately deferential questions, and generally confirming their assumptions about who I was and where I belonged. It was during dessert that the conversation turned to current events, specifically the ongoing conflicts overseas and the administration's military policies. Someone made a comment about supporting the troops that was clearly meant to earn political points rather than express genuine concern. Another guest launched into a detailed critique of military spending that revealed they'd never been closer to actual combat than a Tom Clancy novel. That's when I made my mistake. I offered a perspective based on actual experience, a small correction to a particularly ignorant statement about battlefield conditions. It was nothing dramatic, just a quiet observation that revealed I knew more about the subject than someone in my supposed position should have. The table fell silent for a moment, and I saw Marcus's jaw clench with the particular anger he reserved for moments when I stepped out of the role he'd assigned me. "Sarah doesn't really know what she's talking about," he said with that condescending laugh that had become his default response to my contributions to conversations. "She watches a lot of war movies." And that's when I made my second mistake. Instead of backing down, instead of returning to the submissive silence they expected, I looked him directly in the eye and said, "Actually, I know exactly what I'm talking about." The slap came so fast I didn't have time to react. One moment, I was sitting in my chair, and the next my head was turned to the side, my cheek burning with the imprint of his palm. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gentle clink of ice settling in someone's glass. "Don't you ever contradict me in public again," Marcus hissed, his voice low but carrying clearly in the shocked quiet of the dining room. "Especially not in my parents' house." I touched my cheek gently, feeling the heat radiating from where his hand had connected. Around the table, I could see the faces of Charleston's elite trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed almost approving. His mother had gone pale, but his father was nodding slightly, as if Marcus had finally done something he could respect. In that moment, sitting in that chair with my face burning and their stares weighing on me like physical pressure, I made a decision. These people had spent months treating me like something they'd scraped off their shoes, something unfortunate that had attached itself to their son and needed to be dealt with appropriately. They'd assumed I had no options, no alternatives, no power to change my circumstances. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. I kept my hand pressed to my burning cheek, watching as the dinner guests exchanged glances that ranged from uncomfortable to openly disapproving. Not disapproving of Marcus, of course. Disapproving of me for whatever I'd done to provoke such a reaction from their host's son. Eleanor Blackwood was the first to break the tension, clearing her throat delicately and reaching for her water glass with trembling fingers. "Well," she said in the bright, brittle tone she used when pretending everything was perfectly normal, "perhaps we should move to the sitting room for coffee." The suggestion was met with murmurs of agreement from around the table. People began folding their napkins and pushing back their chairs, eager to escape the awkwardness I'd apparently created by having the audacity to get slapped at their dinner party. Nobody looked at me directly as they filed out of the dining room, but I could feel their judgment like a physical weight. Marcus remained seated, his face flushed with what I assumed was residual anger. His breathing was still elevated, and he kept flexing the hand he'd used to hit me, as if it had been injured in the process. When the last guest had left the room, he leaned forward across the table, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper he used when he wanted to make sure I understood my place. "You embarrassed me," he said, each word carefully enunciated. "In front of people who matter to my family's business, in front of my parents. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I lowered my hand from my cheek and looked at him steadily. The mark was probably already forming, a red handprint that would darken into bruising by morning. I corrected someone who was spreading misinformation about something I happened to know about. "You don't know anything about military strategy or foreign policy," he snapped. "You fix cars for a living. You dropped out of college. You've never been anywhere or done anything that would give you insight into topics that actual educated people discuss." The casual cruelty in his voice was familiar by now, but tonight it felt different. Sharper. More deliberate. He wasn't just angry about being contradicted. He was furious that I'd revealed knowledge that didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed about who I was and what I was capable of. "Where exactly do you think I learned about military operations, Marcus?" I asked quietly. He waved a dismissive hand. "Discovery Channel. History documentaries. You probably read some Wikipedia articles and think that makes you an expert." His laugh was harsh and bitter. "This is exactly why I keep trying to help you understand how the real world works. You can't just insert yourself into conversations between serious people and expect to be taken seriously." I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Around us, the dining room seemed to shimmer with expensive crystal and polished silver, a monument to generations of Blackwood wealth and privilege. Family portraits lined the walls, stern-faced ancestors who'd built their fortune on cotton and shipping, their eyes following every conversation with cold judgment. "You're right about one thing," I said, straightening my shoulders. "I definitely can't expect to be taken seriously by people who think they know everything about everyone, based on appearances." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that in 48 hours, when the Charleston Post and Courier runs their weekend feature on local veterans, your family is going to learn some very interesting things about the woman you just slapped in front of a room full of witnesses." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. "What are you talking about?" "The interview I did last month. The photographer who spent an afternoon at the shop, taking pictures. The article about female veterans who've successfully transitioned to civilian careers." I kept my voice level, conversational. "They'll be running it this Saturday, complete with my full military service record." He stared at me for a long moment, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "You're lying." "Am I? Call the newspaper if you want. Ask for Jennifer Martinez in the features department. She's the reporter who spent 3 hours listening to me talk about my experiences overseas." Marcus pushed back from the table so violently that his chair toppled over, hitting the floor with a crash that echoed through the house. "You're a mechanic," he said, his voice rising. "You live in a crappy apartment above a garage. You wear clothes from Walmart and drive a 15-year-old Honda. You don't have military experience." "I drive a 15-year-old Honda because it's reliable, and I don't need to impress anyone with my car," I replied calmly. "I live above the shop because it's convenient and cost-effective. I wear practical clothes because I work with my hands. None of those things have anything to do with where I've been or what I've done." "You would have told me," he insisted. But there was uncertainty creeping into his voice now. "People don't just hide military service. It's not something you keep secret. Isn't it?" I tilted my head slightly, studying his face. You've spent 6 months telling me about all the ways I don't measure up to your standards, about how I need to improve myself to be worthy of your attention, about how grateful I should be that someone like you would even consider dating someone like me. When exactly was I supposed to mention that I spent 8 years in the army, including 3 deployments to Afghanistan? The crash of the fallen chair had drawn attention from the sitting room. I could hear Eleanor's voice calling out, asking if everything was all right. Marcus glanced toward the doorway, then back at me, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read. 3 deployments, he repeated slowly. 2010, 2012, and 2014. I was a logistics coordinator attached to a forward operating base in Kandahar province. I managed supply chains for a base of 800 soldiers, coordinating everything from ammunition to medical supplies to vehicle maintenance. I straightened my shoulders. I also ran convoy security operations and trained Afghan National Army units in vehicle maintenance and repair procedures. Marcus sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his expensive suit rumpled and his carefully styled hair disheveled. Why didn't you tell me? Because you never asked. In 6 months of dating, you've never once asked me about my background, my education, or my experiences. You looked at my current circumstances and decided you knew everything you needed to know about who I was and where I'd come from. But the shop, the apartment, the way you dress? The shop is mine, free and clear. I bought it with money I saved during my military service. The apartment serves my needs perfectly. My clothes are appropriate for the work I do. I moved around the table toward him, noting how he unconsciously leaned away as I approached. I don't dress to impress your friends because I don't care what they think of me. You could have said something, he muttered, not meeting my eyes. When? When you were explaining to your mother that I was finding myself? When you were telling your friends that I came from a difficult background? When you were instructing me on proper etiquette because you assumed I'd never been anywhere more formal than a diner? Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face composed, but her hands betraying her nervousness as she twisted her pearl necklace. Is everything all right in here? We heard a chair fall. Everything's fine, Mother, Marcus said quickly. Sarah was just leaving. Actually, I said, turning to face Eleanor directly, I was just telling Marcus about the newspaper article that's coming out this weekend. The one about local veterans who've built successful businesses after their military service. Eleanor's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way her face went pale. Military service? 8 years in the Army, I managed logistics operations for forward operating bases in Afghanistan. These days, I run my own business and help other veterans transition to civilian careers. I smiled politely. The reporter was particularly interested in how military training translates to entrepreneurial success. The older woman's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to form words. But you work on cars. I do. It's good, honest work that provides valuable services to my community. The skills I learned maintaining military vehicles translate very well to civilian automotive repair. I glanced between her and Marcus. I'm also certified in heavy equipment repair, diesel engines, and hydraulic systems. The Army invests quite a bit of money training its logistics specialists. William Blackwood chose that moment to lumber into the dining room, probably drawn by the unusual quiet from his wife and son. He took in the scene with the sharp eyes of a man accustomed to reading situations quickly. The overturned chair, Marcus's disheveled appearance, my hand-shaped mark still visible on my cheek. What's going on here? He demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate answers. Sarah was just telling us about her military background, Eleanor said faintly. William's gaze sharpened as it focused on me. Military background? Army logistics. 8 years active duty, 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. I met his stare without flinching. I'm assuming Marcus didn't mention that when he introduced me to the family. The older man's jaw worked, silently for several seconds. Throughout our previous interactions, He'd treated me with the casual dismissiveness reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. Now he was clearly trying to reconcile his assumptions about me with this new information. Logistics, he repeated slowly. Supply chain management, convoy security, equipment maintenance, personnel coordination. I kept my voice professional, the tone I'd used when briefing senior officers. I was responsible for keeping a forward operating base of 800 soldiers supplied and operational in a hostile environment. William sank into one of the dining room chairs, his face suddenly looking older than his 65 years. As a businessman who'd inherited his wealth rather than earning it, he understood enough about real responsibility to recognize what I was describing. Managing supply chains for combat operations wasn't something you learned from books or inherited. From your father. The newspaper article, Eleanor whispered, will be running this Saturday in the features section, complete with photographs of me at work and a detailed discussion of my military service and current business operations. I looked around the room at their shocked faces. I'm sure it will make for interesting reading at the country club. Marcus finally found his voice again. Why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked, and because your assumptions about me were so complete that I was curious to see how long you'd maintain them. I touched my cheek again, feeling the heat that was already beginning to fade. I wanted to understand exactly who you all were when you thought you were dealing with someone who had no power to challenge you. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after the slap. This was the silence of people realizing that their carefully constructed worldview had just been demolished by someone they'd written off as inconsequential. In the sitting room, I could hear the dinner guests making polite conversation, probably wondering what had happened to their hosts and whether they should make excuses to leave early. They had no idea that everything they thought they knew about the woman who'd been slapped at dinner was about to change dramatically. The tension in the dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife as William Blackwood processed what I'd just told them. His fingers drummed against the mahogany table in a rhythm that matched his accelerated heartbeat, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he calculated the social implications of what was about to become public knowledge. Saturday, he said finally, his voice hoarse. The article comes out Saturday. That's right. The Charleston Post and Courier's weekend edition. Circulation of about 80,000 plus their online readership. I smoothed down my skirt, the expensive fabric that Marcus had chosen for me feeling suddenly foreign against my skin. Jennifer Martinez, the reporter, was particularly interested in the angle of women veterans who've successfully integrated into the business community, despite facing various challenges. Eleanor made a small choking sound. Challenges? Well, she'll probably mention the difficulty many veterans face when civilians make assumptions about their capabilities based on their current circumstances, rather than their actual qualifications and experience. I met her horrified gaze steadily. It's a common problem, apparently. People see a veteran working in what they consider a blue-collar job and assume that's an indication of limited intelligence or opportunity, rather than personal choice. Marcus was still slumped in his chair, staring at me like I'd suddenly sprouted a second head. You planned this, he said slowly. You've been planning this whole thing. I planned the interview, yes. It was scheduled weeks ago, long before tonight's dinner party. I adjusted the pearl necklace he'd insisted I wear, feeling the weight of the expensive jewelry against my throat. What I didn't plan was you deciding to hit me in front of a room full of witnesses. That was entirely your own decision. William's business instincts were finally kicking in, overriding his shock. What exactly did you tell this reporter about our family? Nothing. The interview was about my business, my military service, and my work with other veterans. Your family wasn't mentioned at all. I paused, letting that sink in. Of course, that was before tonight. Before your son decided to assault me during a dinner party. The color drained completely from Eleanor's face. You're not going to... You wouldn't tell them about what happened here tonight? about how your son struck me because I dared. To correct someone's misinformation about military operations? I tilted my head thoughtfully. I haven't decided yet. The reporter did give me her direct line in case I had any additional information I wanted to share before the article went to print. Marcus lurched to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. You can't do that. You can't drag our family into some media circus because you're angry about a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I touched my cheek again, where his handprint was already darkening into a bruise. Is that what we're calling assault now? It wasn't assault, he said quickly, glancing toward the doorway where his parents' guests were presumably still waiting. It was... You embarrassed me. You made me look foolish in front of important people. I corrected factually incorrect information. If that embarrassed you, perhaps you should examine why you found accurate information so threatening. I stood as well, noting how he instinctively took a step back. Or perhaps you should consider why you thought physical violence was an appropriate response to being contradicted. William was studying me with the calculating look of a man who'd spent decades navigating Charleston's complex social and political landscape. What do you want? Excuse me? This is obviously some kind of leverage play. You've been pretending to be something you're not, gathering information, positioning yourself for maximum impact. So what's your endgame? What do you want from my family? I laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the elegant dining room. You think this is about money? About trying to extract something from your family? Isn't it? William's voice was cold now, the tone he probably used in business negotiations. You've been dating my son for months under false pretenses. You've allowed us to believe you were something you're not. Now you're threatening to go to the media with damaging information unless we give you what you want. The only thing I want, I said clearly, is for people to stop making assumptions about who I am based on what I do for a living or where I choose to live. I want to be treated with the same basic respect you'd show anyone else. We've always treated you with respect. Eleanor protested weakly. Have you? You've spent 6 months suggesting ways I could improve myself to be more suitable for your son. You've criticized my clothes, my apartment, my career, my education level. You've spoken about me like I was a project Marcus was working on rather than a human being with my own thoughts and experiences. We were trying to help, she insisted. You were trying to remake me into something that fit your preconceptions about what kind of woman deserves to be in your social circle. The fact that I didn't actually need your help, that I was perfectly capable of managing my own life, never occurred to any of you. Marcus had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Now he stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. So what? You thought you'd teach us some kind of lesson by pretending to be someone you weren't? I never pretended to be anyone other than exactly who I am. I told you I owned an auto repair shop. I told you I lived above the business. I told you I preferred practical clothes and simple living. Every single thing I shared with you was completely truthful. But you didn't tell us about the military service, William pointed out, because you never asked. In 6 months, not one. Have you ever asked me about my background, my education, my previous career, or my experiences? You looked at my current situation and decided you knew everything you needed to know about my capabilities and my worth as a person. The sound of laughter drifted in from the sitting room, where the dinner guests were apparently managing to enjoy themselves despite their host's prolonged absence. I wondered what they were discussing, whether they were speculating about the drama that had unfolded at dessert, or simply pretending it had never happened. The newspaper article, Eleanor said suddenly. Would it be possible to delay it? Or perhaps suggest some edits that might be less what? Less accurate? Less honest about the reality of veteran experiences in civilian life? I shook my head. The article is already at the printer. It's going to run exactly as written. But, Surely you understand the position this puts our family in, William said, his businessman's pragmatism finally overriding his shock. Marcus is being considered for the board of several charitable organizations. My business relationships depend on maintaining a certain reputation in the community. Then perhaps you should have considered that before your son decided to hit me in front of a room full of witnesses. I moved toward the doorway, suddenly exhausted by the conversation. Your family's reputation is not my responsibility to protect, especially not after tonight. Marcus stepped into my path, his face desperate now. Sarah, please, we can work this out. We can talk about this reasonably. Can we? Because 5 minutes ago you were telling me I didn't know what I was talking about when I corrected someone's misinformation about military operations. You were explaining to me that I was embarrassing you by having knowledge that didn't fit your assumptions about my intelligence and experience. I didn't know, he said weakly. If I'd known about your military background, you would have. What? Treated me with basic human decency? Shown me the same respect you'd show any other adult? I studied his face, noting the way his eyes kept darting toward his parents. The fact that I served in Afghanistan shouldn't be necessary for you to treat me like a person whose opinions and experiences have value. Of course not. But what, Marcus? But you think military service makes someone more worthy of respect. But you think only certain types of experience qualify someone to participate in conversations about current events? But you think hitting someone is acceptable as long as they don't have credentials that impress you? He had no answer for that, just stood there looking lost and confused while his parents watched from their chairs like spectators at a particularly uncomfortable tennis match. From the sitting room, I could hear Eleanor's guests beginning to make departure noises, the polite murmurs that indicated a dinner party was winding down. They'd probably been waiting for their hosts to return so they could make their excuses and escape the awkwardness that had descended over the evening. I should go, I said finally. Your guests are leaving, and I'm sure you have damage control to discuss. This isn't over, William said, his voice carrying the implicit threat of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and influence. Isn't it? I turned back to face him. What exactly do you think you can do to me, Mr. Blackwood? Damage my reputation in social circles I don't care about? Interfere with my business among customers who judge me by the quality of my work rather than my connections? Spread rumors about me to people who've never heard of your family? The truth of what I was saying hit him like a physical blow. His power, his influence, his carefully cultivated network of wealthy and connected friends meant nothing to someone who operated entirely outside their sphere. I didn't need their approval, their business, or their acceptance. I had built my life completely independent of their world, and they had no leverage over me whatsoever. The article comes out Saturday, I repeated, heading for the doorway. I suggest you prepare your family for some very interesting conversations at the country club. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear Marcus calling after me, his voice high and desperate. But I didn't turn around. I'd spent 6 months letting these people define me according to their limited understanding of what someone like me could be or accomplish. Tonight had shown me exactly who they really were when they thought they held all the power. Saturday's newspaper was going to be very educational for all of them. I drove home through Charleston's quiet streets in my 15-year-old Honda Civic, the same car Marcus had mocked countless times for its dented bumper and faded paint. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night jazz program that matched my contemplative mood as I navigated the familiar route from the historic district to my neighborhood. My cheek still throbbed where his hand had connected, a reminder of how quickly civility could vanish when someone's carefully constructed worldview was challenged. The auto repair shop looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. A modest building wedged between a laundromat and a small grocery store that catered to the working-class families who populated this part of town. The neon sign in the window flickered intermittently, casting alternating red and blue shadows across the cracked sidewalk. To anyone driving past, it was just another small business struggling to make ends meet in a neighborhood that tourists never visited. I parked in the narrow alley beside the building and climbed the external stairs to my apartment, my heels clicking against the metal steps. The sound echoed in the quiet night, probably disturbing Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who went to bed religiously at 9:30 every evening. She was one of my regular customers, a widow who brought her ancient Toyota Camry in for oil changes and always paid an exact change counted out from a small leather purse. Inside my apartment, I kicked off the expensive shoes Marcus had selected and padded barefoot across the worn hardwood floors to the small kitchen. The space was cramped but functional, with appliances that had seen better days and cabinets that stuck when the humidity was high. It was the kind of kitchen that people like the Blackwoods would consider evidence of failure, proof that someone hadn't made the right choices in life. What they didn't know, what Marcus had never bothered to discover, was that this modest apartment sat above a business that generated more revenue than most people realized. Chen's Auto Repair wasn't just a neighborhood garage struggling to survive. It was a carefully designed operation that served multiple purposes beyond the obvious one of fixing cars. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, twisting off the cap and taking a long drink as I looked around the space that had been my home for 3 years. The furniture was secondhand, but it was comfortable and suited my needs perfectly. The decorations were minimal, but each piece had been chosen deliberately. To casual observers, it looked like the home of someone making do with limited resources. To anyone who looked more carefully, it might have seemed odd that someone living so modestly had such an expensive security system. The front room of the apartment contained the usual living space amenities, but behind a door that most visitors assumed led to a closet was something that would have surprised the Blackwood family considerably. I finished my beer and walked to that door, pressing my thumb to a scanner that was cleverly concealed within what appeared to be a standard doorknob. The room beyond was not a closet. It was a fully equipped command center that would have impressed most corporate executives and definitely would have shocked anyone who thought I spent my days changing oil and rotating tires. Multiple monitors lined one wall, displaying real-time information feeds from sources that most civilians never knew existed. High-end computer equipment hummed quietly on custom-built shelves, processing data and maintaining connections to networks that spanned continents. This was where the real work happened. This was where Sarah Chen, the struggling mechanic who lived above her shop, transformed into someone entirely different. For the past 3 years, while Charleston's elite had been dismissing me as another small business owner barely keeping her head above water, I had been running one of the most sophisticated veteran support networks on the East Coast. The auto repair shop was real, and I genuinely enjoyed the work, but it was also the perfect cover for operations that required complete anonymity and total discretion. The computer systems in this room connected me to a network of contacts that stretched from former military intelligence officers now working in corporate security to veterans who had transitioned into roles with federal agencies that preferred to remain unnamed. We shared information, resources, and opportunities in ways that bypassed traditional channels and conventional career paths. My 3 deployments to Afghanistan had been more significant than I'd let on to Marcus and his family. I hadn't just managed logistics for a forward operating base. I had been part of a specialized unit that coordinated intelligence operations across multiple provinces. My role had required building relationships with local contractors, managing complex supply chains that sometimes included materials that weren't listed in any official inventory, and maintaining communication networks that operated parallel to standard military channels. When I'd left the Army, I'd taken with me not just skills in vehicle maintenance and supply chain management, but also expertise in information analysis, network security, and operational planning that translated very well to civilian applications. The problem was that most employers couldn't see past the surface details to understand what those skills actually meant in practical terms. So I'd created my own employment opportunity. The auto repair shop provided perfect cover because it explained, My mechanical skills, my irregular hours, and the variety of people who came and went from the building. No one questioned why a mechanic might work late into the night, or why she might have visitors who drove vehicles with government plates. No one wondered why someone in my position might have sophisticated computer equipment or multiple phone lines. My customers included far more than just neighborhood residents bringing in their family cars. Mixed in with the Toyota Camrys and Ford F-150s were vehicles belonging to people who needed discreet maintenance on equipment that wasn't quite standard civilian issue. Federal agents who couldn't take their surveillance vehicles to dealerships for service. Private contractors who needed modifications that weren't available through conventional channels. Corporate security teams who required specialized equipment that couldn't be traced through normal procurement processes. The repair shop generated enough legitimate revenue to support a modest lifestyle, but the real income came from consulting. Work that didn't appear on any tax returns. Information analysis. Network security assessments. Background investigations that required accessing databases most people didn't know existed. Planning and logistics support for operations that civilian law enforcement agencies occasionally needed, but couldn't officially acknowledge. I moved to the central workstation and activated the secure communication system, entering credentials, that connected me to a network that had been dormant for the past several hours. As the system came online, I could see that messages had been accumulating from contacts across the country, updates on operations that were ongoing, and requests for information that would require careful research. This was my real life, the one that Marcus and his family had never suspected existed. While they'd been condescending to me about my limited prospects and lack of ambition, I'd been coordinating activities that had direct impact on national security operations. While they'd been suggesting ways I could improve myself to be more worthy of their social circle, I'd been providing critical support to operations that would never be acknowledged publicly. The irony was that several of those operations had involved gathering intelligence on the kinds of people who attended dinner parties like the one I'd just left. Corporate executives with questionable international connections. Politicians whose campaign financing included contributions from sources that warranted investigation. Business leaders whose success depended on relationships that federal agencies found interesting. William Blackwood's name had appeared in several reports I'd helped compile over the past year, not as a primary target, but as someone whose business relationships included individuals who were under investigation for activities that ranged from tax evasion to arms trafficking. His company's expansion into overseas markets had brought him into contact with people whose backgrounds included connections to organizations that weren't quite what they appeared to be. I had never mentioned this to Marcus, of course. Our relationship had been compartmentalized completely, a social experiment that had provided useful insights into how Charleston's wealthy elite operated when they thought they were dealing with someone who posed no threat to their interests. The information I'd gathered during 6 months of attending their parties and listening to their conversations had been quietly incorporated into several ongoing investigations. Tonight's confrontation had ended that useful arrangement, but it had also provided something potentially more valuable. Marcus's decision to strike me in front of witnesses had revealed exactly the kind of character traits that federal investigators found interesting when evaluating someone's suitability for positions that required security clearances or government contracts. I opened a secure communication channel and began typing a detailed report of the evening's events. Not for the newspaper reporter, who would be running her article about successful veteran entrepreneurs, but for contacts who tracked the behavior patterns of individuals with access to sensitive information or classified government contracts. Siddiqui. Blackwood family's business empire included several subsidiaries that held federal contracts for infrastructure projects and technology services. William's political connections included relationships with senators and representatives who served on committees that oversaw defense spending and homeland security operations. Marcus's position in the company gave him access to information about government projects that was supposed to be carefully protected. Someone who would strike a woman for contradicting him at a dinner party might not be the most stable individual to have access to classified information. Someone who believed that physical violence was an appropriate response to intellectual challenges might not demonstrate the kind of judgment that federal agencies wanted in their contractors. The report I was preparing would make its way through channels that Marcus and his family would never know existed, evaluated by people whose job it was to assess the reliability and trustworthiness of individuals who wanted to do business with the federal government. The consequences might not be immediate, but they would be thorough and eventually decisive. As I worked, I reflected on the strange path that had brought me to this moment. 3 deployments to one of the world's most dangerous places had taught me lessons about human nature that couldn't be learned in business school or inherited from wealthy parents. I'd seen what people were really like when everything they'd taken for granted was stripped away. When survival depended on accurate assessment of threats and opportunities rather than social connections and inherited advantages. The skills I'd developed in Afghanistan, both officially and unofficially, had proven remarkably applicable to civilian life in ways that most people never imagined. Intelligence gathering, threat assessment, network analysis, and operational security were just as important in corporate America as they had been in combat zones. The main difference was that in civilian life, most people never realized they were being evaluated. Tonight had marked the end of one phase of my post-military career and the beginning of another. The newspaper article that would run on Saturday would establish my public identity as a successful veteran entrepreneur, someone who had transitioned from military service to small business ownership. That narrative was completely true, but it was also deliberately incomplete. What the article wouldn't mention was that my transition had included building one of the most effective intelligence networks on the East Coast, one that operated entirely outside official channels, but provided critical support to operations that helped keep the country safe. What it wouldn't explain was that my modest lifestyle and unassuming appearance were carefully calculated to ensure that no one looked too closely at what I was really doing. Saturday's newspaper was going to change everything for the Blackwood family, but not in ways they would immediately understand. The article about local veterans would be just the beginning of their education about who Sarah Chen really was and what she was actually capable of accomplishing. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Charleston's historic district look like a postcard. I woke at 6:30, the same time I'd been getting up for years, my internal clock still calibrated to military precision despite being out of the service for over a decade. The bruise on my cheek had darkened overnight, a purple-black reminder of Marcus's hand that makeup would only partially conceal. I dressed in my usual work clothes, faded jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen countless hours under car hoods, and made my way downstairs to open the shop. The familiar routine of checking equipment, reviewing the day's appointments, and preparing for the steady stream of customers who depended on Chen's auto repair for honest service at fair prices, felt grounding after the surreal events of the previous evening. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived at 8 sharp for her scheduled oil change, counting out exact change from her small leather purse as always. She noticed the bruise immediately, her weathered face creasing with concern as she handed me the keys to her ancient Toyota Camry. "Mija, what happened to your face?" she asked in the mixture of English and Spanish she used when she was worried. "I walked into a door," I lied smoothly, the excuse that women had been using for generations to explain away evidence of male violence. "Clumsy of me." She studied my face with the shrewd eyes of someone who had raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands, clearly not believing a word of my explanation. But she also understood when certain questions shouldn't be pressed, so she simply nodded and patted my arm gently before settling into the waiting area with her worn romance novel. The morning proceeded normally, a steady rotation of customers, bringing in vehicles for routine maintenance and minor repairs. I lost myself in the familiar rhythm of diagnostic work, the satisfaction of identifying problems and implementing solutions that would keep people safely on the road. There was something deeply centering about mechanical work, the way it required complete focus, and delivered concrete results that could be measured and verified. Around 11, my secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a contact I knew only as Phoenix. The message was brief but significant. Package delivered. Recipient very interested. Expect follow-up within 72 hours. The package in question was the detailed report I'd compiled the previous night about Marcus's behavior at his parents' dinner party. Phoenix was a former military intelligence officer who now worked in a capacity that involved vetting individuals for security clearances and government contracts. The follow-up would likely take the form of a comprehensive background investigation that would scrutinize every aspect of the Blackwood family's business operations and personal conduct. I deleted the message and returned to work on a transmission that was giving me more trouble than expected. The owner was a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her children, and she needed this car to get to both of them. I'd already spent more time on the repair than I was charging for, but some things mattered more than profit margins. At 12:30, I took a lunch break and walked to the small diner 3 blocks away that served the best Cuban sandwiches in the neighborhood. The owner, Carlos, had been a customer for 2 years and had become something of a friend, one of the few people in my daily life who knew me simply as Sarah the mechanic and asked no questions about anything else. "You look like someone kicked your dog," he said as I slid into my usual booth by the window. "Something like that," I replied, ordering my usual sandwich and coffee. Carlos was too tactful to comment on the bruise, but I caught him glancing at it several times as he prepared my food. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where domestic violence was common enough that he recognized the signs, but he also understood that pushing for details was rarely helpful. As I ate, I watched the normal flow of life on the street outside, people heading to work, running errands, managing the countless small tasks that made up ordinary existence. None of them knew that the woman eating a Cuban sandwich in the corner booth had spent the previous evening being slapped by a millionaire's son, or that she was currently coordinating intelligence operations that spanned multiple federal agencies. The afternoon brought a different kind of customer to the shop. Agent Martinez arrived at 2:15, driving an unmarked sedan that had been modified in ways that weren't immediately obvious, but were clearly not standard manufacturer options. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and the kind of alert posture that marked her as someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities simultaneously. "I need some work done on my cooling system," she said, handing me keys that felt heavier than normal car keys should feel. I nodded and pulled the vehicle into the service bay, closing the overhead door behind us. Agent Martinez followed me inside, and we conducted a conversation that any observer would have interpreted as a discussion about automotive repair, but was actually a debriefing about intelligence gathered during 3 months of attending Charleston's high society social events. "The dinner party last night provided some interesting insights," I reported as I pretended to examine her radiator. Several attendees made comments that suggest they have access to information about federal contracting decisions before those decisions are made public. "Insider trading?" she asked, running her finger along the workbench as if checking for dust. "Possibly. More likely, influence peddling. There were references to upcoming infrastructure projects that haven't been announced yet, discussion of which companies were likely to receive specific contracts." I moved to a different part of the engine, maintaining the illusion of mechanical work. William Blackwood seemed particularly well-informed about transportation department decisions. Agent Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "What about the son? Marcus?" Demonstrated a pattern of behavior that raises questions about his emotional stability and judgment under pressure. Someone with his level of access to sensitive information probably shouldn't be prone to violent outbursts when challenged intellectually. Violent outbursts? I turned slightly so she could see the bruise on my cheek. He didn't appreciate being corrected about military operations by someone he assumed was too ignorant to have relevant knowledge. Her expression hardened. "Are you filing charges?" "No. but the incident was witnessed by a room full of people, including several whose opinions matter in Charleston's business community. Sometimes social consequences are more effective than legal ones. We continued the debriefing for another 20 minutes, covering details about political connections, business relationships, and overheard conversations that might be relevant to ongoing investigations. Agent Martinez had been running similar operations in other cities, building a comprehensive picture of how information flowed through networks of wealthy and politically connected individuals. When she left, I returned to normal automotive work, finishing the transmission repair and handling 2 more routine maintenance appointments. The familiar rhythm of mechanical problem-solving helped me process the emotional residue of the previous evening while maintaining the carefully constructed normalcy that was essential to my cover identity. At 5:30, I closed the shop and climbed the stairs to my apartment, where I found 3 missed calls from Marcus on my personal phone. I listened to the voicemails while heating up leftover Chinese takeout for dinner. The progression was predictable. Anger, confusion, attempted bargaining, and finally something approaching panic as the reality of Saturday's newspaper article began to sink in. I didn't return the calls. Instead, I spent the evening reviewing intelligence reports and updating secure databases with information gathered during my months of observation at Charleston's social events. The work was meticulous and important, contributing to investigations that most civilians would never know existed, but that helped protect national security in ways that rarely made headlines. Friday passed quietly, a normal day of automotive. Repair punctuated by secure communications about operations in other cities, and updates on investigations that were developing based on information I'd helped provide. I found myself looking forward to Saturday morning, when the Charleston Post and Courier would finally reveal the truth about who Sarah Chen really was. Saturday arrived with front-page coverage of a political scandal and sports headlines about the local college football team's chances in their upcoming rivalry game. The features section, where Jennifer Martinez's article about local veterans appeared, was buried deep in the newspaper, exactly where stories about successful small business owners usually ended up. But Charleston was a small city where everyone knew everyone else's business. And by noon, the story had rippled through the networks of wealthy families, country club members, and political insiders who formed the backbone of the city's power structure. My phone had been ringing constantly since 8 in the morning. Calls from numbers I recognized and many I didn't. Marcus called 17 times before I finally answered. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice tight with stress. "Do we?" "People are asking questions. About you, about us, about why I never mentioned your military background. My father's business partners are wondering how much you know about their operations." "I imagine they are." "This is serious. There are contracts at stake, political relationships, business deals that took years to develop. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you decided to hit me in front of a room full of witnesses." There was a long silence. Then, "I'm sorry about that. I lost my temper and I shouldn't have. But we can work this out. We can fix this." "Can we?" "Because the newspaper article is just the beginning, Marcus. People are going to start asking questions about a lot of things. About how your family's business operates, about who you associate with, about whether someone with your temperament should have access to sensitive information." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that people who work with federal agencies take a very dim view of individuals who respond to intellectual challenges with physical violence. I'm talking about the possibility that your family's government contracts might be subject to additional scrutiny." The silence stretched longer this time. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" "I want people to treat others with basic human dignity, regardless of their assumptions about social status or background. I want men to understand that hitting women is never acceptable, regardless of the circumstances. I want Charleston's elite to recognize that intelligence and capability come in forms they might not expect. And if we If my family acknowledges that? If we make changes? Then perhaps the additional scrutiny will be less intensive. Perhaps the questions that are going to be asked will have satisfactory answers. I ended the call and returned to my weekend routine of organizing intelligence reports and coordinating with contacts across the country. By Monday morning, the ripple effects of Saturday's newspaper article would have spread through Charleston's power networks, raising questions and creating opportunities for investigations that had been stalled by lack of access to the right social circles. The woman who fixed cars in a modest neighborhood shop had finally revealed herself to be something far more complex and capable than anyone had imagined. And the people who had underestimated her were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never saw coming. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or written off by people who should have known better, then you understand exactly why I spent 6 months letting Marcus and his family reveal their true character. Sometimes the most powerful response to condescension isn't argument or confrontation. It's simply showing people who you really are and letting them deal with the consequences of their assumptions. Hit subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who found strength in being underestimated, and remember, never judge someone by their current circumstances. You never know what they're really capable of accomplishing.